Our Bible study today is on Daniel chapter 1, beginning at verse 1. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the blessings that you've given to us through Daniel. As a young man, he remained faithful to you, even in the midst of terrible events, as he was taken into exile into Babylon with his friends, and yet he determined to remain faithful to you, to serve you even while he was under the jurisdiction of the king of Babylon. And Lord, we ask that you would help us to see the circumstances of our life not as hardships, but as opportunities to share a witness of your love and your power in our lives in this world. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, we'll start off with a little bit of background for the book of Daniel. So, the book of Daniel corresponds with events that happened in the life of Daniel from the time that he was taken into exile as a young man, and so it doesn't say how old he was when he went into exile, but it's possibly around 20 years of age because of the kinds of things that he was asked to do soon after he was taken into exile. And so we would say that was probably around, that would have been around 605 BC. 605 BC was the time when King Nebuchadnezzar began his deportation of the people of Judah. Right, so I don't know if you're familiar, like in the very end of 2 Kings, it talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. And so that's the final exile. But that final exile, which was everything in the Old Testament is building up to God punishing his people for their idolatry and their rebellion against him. And that culminates with the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. And most people think about the exile of 586 BC as the only exile. But in fact, there was two others before this. And then there was even another one back in 722 by the Assyrians, but that was where they took the northern kingdoms into exile. And that was a different thing. I mean, they took those people, a lot of the Jewish people from the 10 tribes to the north in Israel, to Mesopotamia, but Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, which was northern part of Mesopotamia, whereas Babylon is central. That's where Baghdad is today. So Babylon is Baghdad, and that the Babylonian Empire began to grow in the beginning of the end of the 600s, because it counts down, right? So 605 is the time where King Nebuchadnezzar had taken the throne, and he wanted to expand his empire, and he had already taken over a ton of areas for all the way through the Mesopotamian area, all the way across to the Mediterranean, which would, the northern part of that area would have been, Turkey, and below that is Syria. And so right where the Sea of Galilee is, that was kind of like the extent of his empire up until 605. And at that point, he decided, I'm going to start taking over Judah, or Israel, that is, in the northern country of Israel. And so that's when he started to take over the area that was run by, as we start to read, it talks about Jehoiakim, the king of Judah. So there was like 3 kings who ruled in Judah in the last days before Jerusalem was destroyed. And under those kings, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah, those 3 kings were the ones who ruled up until the final exile when the city was destroyed. Okay, so we're kind of like counting down from 605 to 586. That's the period that of those 3 exiles. And so the first exile is when the northern part around the Sea of Galilee were taken, people around just north in the northern part. And Daniel apparently was in that first deportation. Okay, so I have little bullet points under important background for chapter 1, so you can see I mentioned those dates, that 605 was when Daniel was taken from the first deportation. The second one took place in 597, and that's when Ezekiel, the prophet, was taken into exile. And then the final deportation, the final exile was 586 when the city of Jerusalem was destroyed. Now, as we read through chapter 1, we're going to see a narrative, a story about Daniel, who's in training as a young man in the courts of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. And then it mentions, if you just jump to chapter 1, verse 21, it says, Daniel remained there, that is in Babylon, until the first year of King Cyrus. So it kind of gives us the whole scope of the whole book in the first chapter, right? So it tells us that he was taken into exile, doesn't tell us the year, but we know that that's 605. And then it tells us about what's going to happen at the end of the book when the Babylonian Empire is destroyed by the Persian Empire. And so that's when Cyrus, the king of Persia, takes over. And then Daniel starts working for the new king, right? I mean, so he basically said, when Cyrus took over, he took all of the wise men and said, okay, you guys know a lot of information, so I'm not, he was not going to kill them because that's not helpful to run a government when the people that you are supposed to be helping you are dead. So, he could have put his own people in there, but they don't know anything about running the government because the government had been run by governors for, decades, right? And so, in fact, Daniel, because he was educated around 20 years of age, and then the destruction of Babylon happened when he was 89, that meant that he started working for the king of Persia when he was 89 years old. That's pretty old, but he worked for him for another couple of decades, so at least another 10, 15 years. So he lived to an old age. And so another part of the background is, you can see under my outline, the second major bullet point up above, it talks about the book of Daniel is written in two languages. And so the first part, chapter 1, and the last part, chapters 8 through 12, are written in Hebrew. And the middle section, chapters 2 through 7, are written in Aramaic. Right, so Aramaic is a language that uses the Hebrew alphabet, but it's a different language. It was the language of the Persian Empire. It was written, and so why does he use the Persian this language that the Persians were using? Because that was the official language at the time he wrote it. He didn't write any of this during the Babylonian Empire because, of course, he talks about stuff that happens under Cyrus. So after Cyrus took over in 605, it was probably around. Cyrus took over in 539, and then so it was around 530 that scholars believe that he wrote the book of Daniel. So about 9 years into his service of King Cyrus. Okay, so we can see that he's looking back at his life as an old man, and he's writing down all these stories, and he writes, and so why is it in two languages? Most likely, it has to do with the fact that the middle section, which includes the majority of the stuff that happens during the king of Babylon, is written as kind of maybe official historical documents from the Persian Empire about what had happened. And so he took these documents and then he used them for his own purposes. So he has a Hebrew introduction and a Hebrew conclusion with the middle part that was kind of official documentation that wasn't just readable or understood just by the Jewish people, but by all the people in the empire at the time. So it's most likely he's using other written sources in order to keep track of the dates and stuff like that. Now it's interesting that a lot of modern scholars deny the authority, the authorship of Daniel. They say Daniel couldn't have written it. There's nobody named Daniel. The people who he talks about are fake. He made them all up, because up into through the 1800s there was no written evidence outside of the Bible of certain people like Darius the Mede and Belshazzar, who was the great grandson of King Nebuchadnezzar. They're like, nobody mentions these people outside the Bible, so the Bible made it up. Well, this is, of course, historical critical scholars that they start with the assumption that miracles don't happen, predictive prophecy is impossible, and that the Bible is a human book written with errors in it. Right? So those kinds of assumptions are gonna bias you towards rejecting anything that can show that what it's saying. But in the 1900s, 20th century, they started archaeological excavations in Iraq and Iran that uncovered written documentation of Belshazzar and some of the other places and things that are mentioned. So unlike, like the Book of Mormon, that mentions all kinds of places that no evidence has ever been found over the last couple hundred years, whereas the Bible, over thousands of years, has been proven to be true over and over and over again. So the Bible continues to be seen to be a true book. Now the other problem is the idea that how can Daniel so accurately describe the kinds of prophecies about the nations that he mentions? For instance, the middle section, chapters 2 through 7, he mentions the nations of the world, and he talks about these. King Nebuchadnezzar has a vision about a statue, and then he builds a statue later on in chapter 3. But in chapter 2, the statue that he sees in his dream has 4 different types of metal. And then Daniel is the only one who can interpret his dream, because all the other people can't figure it out, right? All the other wise men who are not, they're not believers in the true God, so they're just magicians, right? So God doesn't allow them to reveal. Well, it makes it even harder because King Nebuchadnezzar doesn't just say, tell me what my dream means. He says, tell me my dream, and then tell me what it means. And nobody can even do that. That's impossible, right? Except for Daniel. When Daniel is being escorted in chapter 2 to be executed because King Nebuchadnezzar was mad because nobody could tell him what his dream was, he said, what good are you wise men if you can't tell me what my dream is and tell me what it means? So they were all being taken to be executed. And then they showed up at his house, and he says, well, why am I going to be executed? And they said, because none of the wise men can tell the king his dream. And he says, well, nobody asked me. And they said, can you do it? And he says, no, but my God can. Right, so that's important to point out. So throughout the whole book, he's witnessing to the power and sovereignty of the true God of the universe, Yahweh. The God of Israel is not just the God of a country, he's the God of the world and the universe. And so Daniel is always proclaiming that. And he doesn't just do it to King Nebuchadnezzar, but to all the other kings. So he works for King Nebuchadnezzar, and then his son, his grandson, and then the next king that comes from the next empire, the Persian Empire, Cyrus, and then his son, and so on. So he lives through like 4 or 5 different kings. He's serving them for like his entire life, for like almost 90 years. It's amazing. But Daniel's able to show that God is in control, and so this and so the prophecies. I was starting to talk about how the prophecies were thought to be impossible to be so accurate, because the first dream of Nebuchadnezzar is the statue with 4 types of metal, and so each one of those represents a different kingdom. So just explain that real quick, because we'll get into that later on. But these 4 kingdoms are the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire. Now, when did the Romans rule in the ancient world? They ruled from around 100 BC until about, and then it depends on, when you say the Roman Empire ended, 500 AD, or maybe a little bit sooner, but still hundreds of years that they ruled. And obviously Daniel was written before the Romans even showed up. So do we have any proof that the book of Daniel was written before 100 BC? Do we have any proof of that? I mean, because you could say that it was written before that, but people in the future might say, people just claiming it was written earlier, but we know that it had to have been written after these countries existed. So some people try to say that Daniel was finalized in the 1st century BC, which is crazy, because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the existence of the Dead Sea Scrolls are proof that the book of Daniel is predictive in its prophecies, because the Dead Sea Scrolls date back to 200 BC. Plus we have the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and that was translated in the 300s BC. So if and the book of Daniel was included in that. So if we have the book of Daniel translated in the 300s and the book of Daniel found in the Old Testament or in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 200s, how is it even possible that it wasn't even finished until the 100s? This is what, higher critical scholars are claiming. So there's a lot of evidence against that, and yet, despite the fact that the evidence is almost, a clear-cut case, higher critical scholars still refuse to believe that the book of Daniel was written until the time of the Roman Empire. And it's only because of their rejection of predictive prophecy. Right? No, I mean, how can you even be a Christian and not believe in predictive prophecy? But, there are Christians who want to be progressive or, they think that they're, more enlightened than people who, because there's this understanding in our modern world, even among people who are religious, that, that believing in predictive things and prophecies and miracles is primitive. And that this is an example of, early superstitious beliefs among human beings, and that we've evolved beyond that type of thing. So now we have science to prove that things are either right or wrong. So the problem with that is that there's evidence that shows that, yes, Daniel did, in fact, predict the future. Now, not everything he said has even come true yet, but because the majority of things that he said did come true, we can trust the things that haven't made it into history yet. So, so we'll be talking about that during the class, but, the four countries that he talks about over and over again, he mentions them in several places. He talks about them in the dream from King Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2, but then he talks about them again in chapters 8 through 12, where he talks about the vision of the ram and the goat. And so he has these... and it's not because he's predicting different events in different times. The book of Daniel is written in apocalyptic literature as an apocalypse. Apocalypse is a type of writing that uses symbolic explanations in order to kind of hide what it's talking about from certain people. For instance, Daniel is using apocalyptic descriptions of the future because it's not written for the Babylonians or the Persians. It's written for God's people. It's to give us, give the people of Israel comfort in the fact that God is not going to abandon them. He's going to care for them. And so the book of Daniel is really the backbone of the book of Revelation. Because in the New Testament, the Revelation written by John in around between 90 and 100 AD, is using the same apocalyptic basis as Daniel does. So, and it's usually a cyclical thing. So you talk about an event and describe it, and then you go back to the beginning and you start over with the same event and you describe it a second time, and then you use a third type of symbolism and explain it a third time. So in the book of Revelation, you see there's the seven seals being broken, then the seven trumpets being blown, and then the seven bowls poured out. It's the same description three times. The book of Daniel does the same thing. It uses, three different explanations of the same events in order to, carry through the point that God is going to work this out in history. Okay, any questions so far about the background? So, just keep in mind how Daniel is recalling his life at the end of his life, and he starts out with chapter 1, where he's talking about what happened when he was a young boy. Okay, would somebody begin reading the first paragraph of Daniel 1?
So where does your paragraph break?
Verses 1 and 2.
In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God.
Okay, so since scholars have been able to figure out, the dating of the kings of Israel and Judah. We would be able to date the third year of King Jehoiakim to 605 BC. But sometimes, people might point out that if you were to find out when did Jehoiakim rule, and you look like at Jeremiah 25 verse 1, and it describes events in a different way. So some people have said, well, look, it looks like they're describing a date that happened at different times. And so the explanation behind that is the fact that the Israelites in the north and the people of Judah in the south had different ways of counting the reigns of kings. And so the first full year of a kingship would begin on the New Year's Day after the ascension of the king, whereas in the Judahite system in the south, they counted the year of ascension as the first year of the reign. And so they had sometimes the dating was like off by 6 months to a year, right? So around 605 is true no matter what. But sometimes the discrepancy has been pointed out by scholars as their idea of proof that the Bible is in error. But what we're working with is people who lived in a time where there was no recording devices, no videotapes, no photographs, so you cannot absolutely determine dating. It's all in your memory, right? You have to remember things, and then you have to explain it. So ancient people's way of writing to history was different than the way we write. We are completely, dependent upon our technology in order to give a chronological description of an event, right? And so, the whole idea of chronology in a specific order and time is a modern invention. Most times people remembered things because of their significance and the themes. And so like even the Gospels were written in a way that doesn't just show, this happened and this happened and this happened, but it was like, these are the things that happened in Jesus' ministry. And so a lot of the things, like the Sermon on the Mount, did Jesus sit on a mountain and go through a 3-chapter sermon? Maybe. But most likely he preached those same things over and over and over again, so that it was a collection of the things he had been preaching for the 3 years. And that doesn't make it any less valuable simply because, we don't know for sure if he stood up and said 3 chapters at a time, because that's not the point. The ancient people wouldn't have even cared if Jesus spoke it in order in that exact way. Everything he says in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 3 through 9, about 3 through 9, or 4 through 9 that is spoken by Jesus. And so we don't know when he said it, but we know he said it. And so for the writers of the in the early centuries, that was the only thing that mattered to them, that Jesus said it, and that it was true and was important. Same thing with Daniel. Daniel's writing down things that happened and were true and they were important, but he writes them in under the understanding of the events and their significance in the lives of God's people, rather than saying, this exact time, because there's no way of determining it, right? How would you, if I tell you it happened in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, and then somebody else says it was in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, how do you know which year it was? It depends on the dating system where you're at, because each country had their own dating system. Okay, and of course we're talking about the difference between the Israelites in the north, which are the 10 tribes that broke away after Solomon's son Rehoboam, split the kingdom, and then the 2 tribes in the south, Judah and Benjamin, which had the longest run until the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in 586. Okay, so so we have a beginning date of his taken into exile. He's around 20 years old, and it tells us what was happening. So even though Nebuchadnezzar had sent troops down to the northern part of Galilee to take some of those people into exile, he also put Jehoiakim, the king at Jerusalem, put him under a vassalship. That meant that he was told, you can keep ruling under my jurisdiction, and the only way I'm going to let you keep ruling and stay alive is if you pay me tribute tax, right? So he had to tax the people of Judah, and he had to send, a certain amount of gold to Babylon every year. And if he didn't do it, then he would send the troops down and kill him. So it was really extortion money, international extortion. And so this was what was done in the ancient world for millennia, right? And so the only way to stop the taxation, and it wasn't just a little bit, the thing is that King Jehoiakim had to tax his people an exorbitant amount of money in order to pay the tribute tax to King Nebuchadnezzar. And then the people would start rebelling against him because he's like, they would say, we can't afford it. We can't spend anymore. We can't give you any more money. And he says, well, if you don't give it to me, then I'm not going to be able to pay Nebuchadnezzar, and then he's going to kill us all. So it's either the people rebel and stop paying the taxes, and then the kingdom falls, or the king, King Jehoiakim has to convince the people to do it, or they stop. And so that's what happens is when a king would die, usually the vassals, the kings who were underneath him, would stop paying the taxes. And then the new king of Babylon would have to show he was worth his weight. Then he would come down and attack, and then he would put them under another vassalship, otherwise, another type of extortion. So Nebuchadnezzar was trying to show King Jehoiakim. He said, I'm going to let the city of Jerusalem be spared, but part of my initial tributary taxes is going to be the articles from the temple of Yahweh. And he carried off all the treasures, the gold treasures from the temple to Babylon. So, he didn't carry off everything, but the kinds of things he would have carried off would have been, gold plates, gold serving goblets, all kinds of things that would have been used for the temple worships, services that were valuable. Eventually, he's going to take even the menorah, the gold menorah that's inside of the temple, not in the Holy of Holies, but the holy spot between the steps and the back in the middle part. That thing is, there's a modern day reproduction of it in Jerusalem. And the reason is because the Jewish people in Jerusalem believe that they're going to rebuild the temple for the third time someday, and so they have this built in it's in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, and it's within view of the Temple Mount. It's like on this section of the hill of Jerusalem, and it's in the middle of the street, and it's in a plexiglass box. The thing is that it weighs thousands of pounds because it's pure cast gold. And so this is the kind of thing that would have been super valuable to Nebuchadnezzar. The menorah is made to look like 7 branches of almond branches with the blossoms where the candles were, and they'd be little blossoms out of gold that'd be cups that you'd fill with oil and have a wick that would hang out of it. And those, were supposed to keep them burning 24/7 inside the temple. So that was the most valuable thing, but it was so heavy that, in the first deportation, King Nebuchadnezzar didn't take that, but he took a bunch of other stuff. Okay, and it tells us they took them to the temple of his God in Babylonia. So in most modern translations, the word Babylonia is a translation of a word that usually is pronounced Shinar, and that's like if you have a King James Bible, it'll say Shinar. Shinar is the ancient. So ESV is like almost like they're going back to the King James in order to.
Literal.
Yeah, it's very, very literal. But it is Babylonia, and so that's why most modern translations will use that. And vice versa. The other description of the country of Babylon, anybody know what's the country of Babylon called in the like in the King James Bible? It's Chaldeans, right? So, yeah, a lot of people, older Bibles will say Chaldeans. I think the RSV, the King James, they'll use the phrase, the king of the Chaldeans, Nebuchadnezzar. But, the Chaldean is a word that's not used in modern archaeological and other historical books. So most Bibles will translate that as Babylon rather than Chaldea.
What would that be today?
Babylon is the city of Baghdad. Modern day Baghdad is in the same spot, just a little bit north of the city, as the ancient ruins of King Nebuchadnezzar's palace. So same place.
It's between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Rivers.
Okay, so verse 3. Could somebody read that?
Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans.
Right, or the Babylonians, depending on your translation. Okay, well, so through verse 4. So we'll talk about those sections. So Nebuchadnezzar has a guy who's in charge of his wise men, right? So the wise men are sometimes, later on, what are the wise men going to be called under the Persian Empire?
Magi?
The Magi, right? So Daniel he's going to become the chief wise men or Magi in Babylon, and eventually over all the Persian wise men, so that he probably set up the kind of things to study for future generations. So the time between Daniel and the time of Jesus was about 438 years, and in that time period, Daniel had already set up a learning system that had probably lasted to the time of the Magi that came to visit the baby Jesus. And if they were accurately following what Daniel had written, because, he wrote it in Aramaic so that the people of the country of Persia understood it, and then they were able to see the prophecies and count down to the time, because it even says in chapter, the chapter that talks about the coming of, which one is that? Is it chapter 10 or 11? Yeah, the one that talks about the 77s, the 70 weeks, and stuff like this. And so those are describing the countdown, because the word week can actually just mean the word 7. So if you have 77s, that's 449 years, right? And so from the time of 490 years, right? So 490 years from the time of the rebuilding of the temple until the time of Jesus, and so till the week of the end of Jesus' ministry. So you actually have an exact countdown clock. So for any of the Jewish people wondering, is Jesus the Messiah? If they didn't bother to read Daniel, then they could have said Jesus wasn't the Messiah. But if they read it, there's no doubt about the fact that Jesus shows up at the exact timing that Daniel says the Messiah will show up. So definitely they had every reason to understand that Jesus would be the Messiah, because Daniel had predicted it 490 years earlier.
He says Daniel is from a royal family. Is that what it's implying here?
Yeah. Well, I mean, from the royal. Let's see. It says that the king ordered Ashpenaz to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility. So that would have been people who would have been from the line of David, as well as anybody else who was part of the nobility. So Daniel was from an important family. It doesn't claim that he's from the line of David, but it just means he was, somebody from an important family. So, and that usually the Babylonians took 3 groups of people into exile. They took the royal families, they took the priests, and then they took the aristocracy. So basically anybody who had any money or influence was taken into exile. If you had nothing, they didn't bother with you, because you had no influence and you had no power. So, anybody who could start a revolt against Babylon was taken away so that they couldn't start a revolt. But the people who just had no money or no influence were just left behind. And then they moved in people from Mesopotamia and other countries back into the area. And so they kind of just transferred people around, so that you ended up with people intermarrying with foreigners that were moved into your area. And then what happens is that would dilute the nationality, so there would be less chance of civil war. So, or people trying to start a rebellion against the Babylonians. So he was. It doesn't say he's specifically from a royal family, but it says that those are the types of people that the king ordered. So Ashpenaz is the person who's in charge of kind of like the wise men's school. And then notice that the requirements in verse 4 of a person who Nebuchadnezzar would want to be in his, under his, these would be advisors, right? So what kind of advisors you want? Young men without any physical defect, So they couldn't have handicaps. They had to be handsome because he was kind of vain. So if you're going to have wise men telling you what to do, they better be good looking. You don't want any ugly people. So notice that this shows the kinds of qualities that the world values, right? The world values people who are physically fit, who are good looking, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace.
It also shows what a hard job Ashpenaz had.
Yeah,
Because
Ashpenaz.
that's not something that's easy to judge in somebody, when you've got just a few moments to herd them up and drive them off to a foreign country.
Right. No. Well, this didn't happen right away. Is after the people had already been taken into exile, they, what they would have done was taken the royal families, the nobility, and the priestly class into, and they would have put them into special districts, right? So they would have already known where these people were. They would already recognize that some of them were, better off than others. And so when when Ashpenaz is recruiting, he already probably had a good idea of where to look and who to find, because they immediately started, the Jewish people would have started synagogues wherever you had, like 10 Jewish men, then that could be a place a synagogue could start. And so they would have started synagogues within their new districts in Babylon. And so he probably went to these synagogues and recruited some of these young men to be part of the advisors or the wise men. Because the king told him to do this. And of course, what kinds of things does he have to teach them? Notice it says the language. So what language is that? That would have been the Babylonian language, right? And it's what does anybody know what the Babylonian languages are written in?
Aramaic.
No.
Did you tell us earlier?
Cuneiform. So because Aramaic is the language of the Persian Empire, and this was written after the Babylonian Empire was already destroyed. So cuneiform is a Babylonian alphabet, and so the language and the literature of the Babylonians, and he doesn't necessarily give it a name. Like, I don't know if there are names for some of the languages that are found in the ancient world, like Akkadian is another type of language. There's cuneiform, which is actually an alphabet. I don't think it's called the cuneiform language. Then Babylonian language was using cuneiform. So there was all kinds of Semitic languages. The word Semitic comes from the word Semite, which means a person from the origin of that area of the Middle East, which included the Israelites, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and lots of different other people in that same area. So they had to learn the language and the literature of the Babylonians, which included, the study of the gods. So that would have been like the myths. There's actually a thing called the Babylonian creation myth. It's called the Enuma Elish, and some people believe it was written in the as far back as the 18th century BC. Some bring it to the say that it was written in the 12th century BC. But either way, that would have predated the time of Daniel. So that would have been probably so the Babylonian Empire, it is sometimes dated to that far back, which is the time of the patriarchs. But because we're talking about Daniel, who lived in the 500s, this would have been the 6th century, right? So how do you say that the Babylonian Empire started that far back when we know that there was other countries before them, like the Syrians and the Hittites? Well, that's why sometimes Nebuchadnezzar's rule is sometimes called the Neo-Babylonian Empire, because it's the same area and the same capital, but it's not as old as some of the civilizations that existed in that same area before this. So in essence, we could just call it the Neo-Babylonian Empire, but they still study these ancient myths, and the myths about this god named Marduk, who was like the chief god of the gods, and then there was a goddess who was like a dragon named Tiamat, and they had this fight, and in the fight, Marduk slays Tiamat and cuts her body in half and uses her carcass to create the heavens and the earth. So that part of her body becomes the heavens, and part of her body becomes the earth, and then her blood and her bones become the human beings. So Marduk creates humans out of the blood and the bones of Tiamat. So that's part of the mythology of the Babylonians. And so that's the type of thing that Daniel would have had to learn. Now, obviously, learning it is different than believing it, right? So, did God's people have to learn about what happened under the Greek Empire? Most likely, during Hellenization, Antiochus Epiphanes I tried to force the Jewish people during the time of the Maccabees, between the Old and New Testament period, tried to force them into becoming like the Greeks. So they wanted them to wear togas, they wanted them to go to the Circus Maximus, watch people being gladiators, fight to the death. And he even tried to put a statue of Zeus in the temple of Jerusalem, and he slaughtered a pig, a sacrifice to Zeus in the temple. And how did the Jewish people respond to that?
They were upset.
They were very upset. In fact, they started violently fighting against the Greeks to their death. They would rather die than become Greek. And so that's why when the Romans came along, the Romans said, okay, you Jewish people, we know you're not going to change, so we'll let you worship at your temple, and you just pay us an extra taxes to use your temple. So that's why the Greeks fought against the Jews, and the Romans didn't until finally in 70 AD they actually got tired of the squabbling and they destroyed the temple. But under the Babylonian Empire, the Jewish people were allowed to, they kept their temple and Jerusalem until Nebuchadnezzar got fed up with them and he destroyed it in 586. But we're still talking about the first exile, so it's 605 until that happened. These people are hoping they're going to go back, knowing that Jerusalem is still there. So, whenever Daniel is going to pray, he's going to face to the west, because he's east of Jerusalem. He faces out and looks towards Jerusalem to pray, and we'll find that gets him in trouble later on. But the kinds of things that he had to learn would have been, kind of shocking. The Jewish people didn't want to do those things, but he's making a good situation, or trying to make a good experience out of a bad situation. God places him in this circumstance where he's going to work for a foreign king. Now, he could say, I'm not going to do that, kind of like the Maccabees did when the Greeks tried to force them to become Hellenized. But instead, he realizes, I'll do what I can to follow God's will, but I'll also work for the king because, maybe I can be a witness. And that's exactly what he does. Throughout the whole book, he's going to be witnessing to the truth about the true God.
A little bit like Joseph.
Yeah, there we go. So, in a lot of ways, Daniel is kind of like he's the Joseph of his generation. Yeah, and of course, he's a young man. He's taken to exile, kind of like Joseph in Egypt. Okay, and so it tells us that Ashpenaz, in the end of verse 4, he was to teach them, that is, the young men. It doesn't tell us who all the young men are yet, but that they're going to be learning that language and the literature. And then the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Okay, so they get this 3-year, get their master's degrees. They get a chance to work for the king. But let's look at the first couple of questions under my study guide. Number 1, why was Judah exiled to Babylon by God? So the very reason for the exile in the first place is not a surprise, even though the Jewish people didn't always expect it, but the Bible tells us why it happened. So let's look at the first passage from Leviticus 25, 1 through 7. Yep.
The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, When you come into the land that I gave you, the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap what grows of itself in your harvest, or gather the grapes of your undressed vine. It shall be a year of solemn rest for the land. The Sabbath of the land shall provide food for you, for yourself, and for your male and female slaves, and for your hired servant and the sojourner who lives with you, and for your cattle and for the wild animals that are in your land. All its yield shall be for food.
Okay, so it's talking about, a Sabbath, not only the Sabbath for the week, you rest at the end of the week, but a Sabbath for the land. So every seventh year, you have to allow the land to lay fallow in order to give it rest. And then, without, you don't have to read the next section, but if you jump ahead to verse, chapter 26, verse 27 through 35, it talks about some other things, some other rules that God gave. Now, these have been part of the civil law of the Old Testament for the people of Israel. Leviticus 26, 27. It talks about, this is talking about punishments and disobedience.
About what the,
False idols.
what the consequences.
Yeah, the consequences, right. If in spite of this you still do not listen to me, but continue to be hostile towards me, then in my anger I will be hostile toward you, and I myself will punish you for your sins 7 times over. You will eat the flesh of your sons and the flesh of your daughters. So that's what happened. Cannibalism ended up becoming the only option to survive when the Babylonian Empire surrounded Jerusalem and put them under siege. It was a whole year that they had no food going in or out, so people ended up almost starving to death. So a lot of times they'd wait till a person died and then they'd eat them. And that was in Jerusalem in 586, before Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem, because it took a whole year for him to get into the city because the walls are so big, so huge. And so it goes on to say in verse Leviticus 26:30, I will destroy your high places. A high place is like a altar for Baal, not for God, but so that's what happened is the people started worshiping Baal instead of God in the later years. I will destroy your high places, cut down your incense altars, and pile your dead bodies on the lifeless forms of your idols, and I will abhor you. I will turn your cities into ruins and lay waste your sanctuaries. I will take no delight in the pleasing aroma of your offerings. I will lay waste the land so that your enemies who live there will be appalled. I will scatter you among the nations and will draw out my sword and punish you or pursue you. So you can see that what he's describing is the exile. This is written by Moses, in the 14th century BC, 15th century that is, 1446 was the exile. Was the Exodus, that is, 1446, 15th century BC. He's already prophesying the punishment that's going to happen to both Israel under the Assyrians in 722 and to Judah by the Babylonians in 586. So that's the reason why, and it gives you some of the details. What are some of the reasons why God sent Judah into exile?
Didn't listen to him.
Okay, disobeying, and worshiping idols, and even some things that you might even say, well, worshiping idols is bad, but why is it so bad to harvest your field for 7 years in a row? Right? 6 years you can do it. 7th year you have to let it lie fallow. How do you make money if you don't continue farming every year, right? And so you trust in the Lord. You have to save up so that you can make it through the year that you're not using your fields, or you just let some fields lay fallow and other fields you use. So you just take turns going back and forth to your land. You don't just have to squeeze out every amount of money that you can out of your land. That's greedy, and that's one of the reasons why God commands these things. It's actually good practice to allow some of the land to rest, and when we try to get as much money as we can out of things, sometimes it wears us out. It shows that we don't trust in God for our future, and what we're doing is we're competing with other people rather than trusting in the Lord.
That's interesting. You're saying this plot can rest 1 year and this plot can rest another year?
No.
They don't have to be the same year.
Yeah, it's just like every 7 years a plot has to rest, so they don't have to, like, it wouldn't be like the entire nation would on the 7th year nobody could plant. No, it's just that sections would have to be given rest.
Staggering.
Yeah, you could stagger it, so that would be a way of fulfilling the law.
But wasn't there a jubilee at 7 times 7 years?
Right, and the Jubilee year
And that was
described,
involved.
that was back in, we didn't read that, but in Leviticus 25, verse 8, count off 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7 Sabbaths of years amount to a period of 49 years. Then have a trumpet sounded everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement. Sound the trumpet throughout the land. Consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to its inhabitants. So the Jubilee year wasn't necessarily a year that, that all the land had to lay fallow, but it was the forgiveness of debts, and that a person who was indentured like a servant or a slave had to go free. And so what happens is the Israelites didn't do these things. And some people have commented that, remember we talked about how the 77s, 490 years, that God was waiting till the Messiah came, was a payment for all the Sabbath, or all the Jubilee years that they didn't do over the centuries. So I've never looked into that in detail, but it's possible that God was basically saying, okay, you went 490 times you ignored the Jubilee year, or you maybe ignored the Sabbath years or something, since I established you as a nation in the country of Israel. And they ignored it. So he says, okay, now I'm going to force you to let the land lay fallow, because you're not going to be able to work it because you're not going to be there. So that might have been part of his punishment. But it's predicted long before it happened. And then the Second Chronicles passage is probably just another version of the same thing. But it just talks about how God's going to punish the people of Israel for their idolatry. And then let's see. The next section we haven't even talked about the meanings of his names. So maybe we'll stop here, and then next week we'll continue with Daniel chapter 1, starting at verse 6, because that's where the names of the friends of Daniel are mentioned.
So that's Monday, Thursday.
So yeah, we'll start next week on Monday, Thursday then.